This couple just moved in together. They want to live together. But there is a huge problem. In the apartment there lives a ghost. And the ghost is a hardcore fan of BL stuff. And you can guess how wild this story is gonna get. If you find a massive apartment for the price of a cup of coffee, you don't ask if someone died there, you just sign the lease and hope your roommate is hot. Well, Jehyeon did exactly that, and now he's living the ultimate, be careful what you wish for, nightmare. He thought the biggest challenge would be his broke, occult-obsessed roommate Younghoo, who apparently thinks clothes are a suggestion because, quote, we've both got the same parts. But the real problem? The ghost living in their walls is a total BL fanatic. She doesn't want their souls, she just wants to see the live-action movie from the front seat. Amazing, right? Imagine trying to live a normal, logical life while a spectral pervert is literally drop-kicking you into your roommate's bed just to see some skinship. This isn't a haunting, it's a forced proximity fanfic come to life, and the ghost is the director. Honestly, if my life was being scripted by a perverted spirit with a shipping addiction, I'd probably want a refund on the rent to Teo Choi Jehyeon. The world has always been a place of logic and reason. He never had any room for superstitions, firmly believing that ghosts and spirits were nothing more than absurd fantasies. In his mind, only those who were weak or pathetic relied on such delusions to make sense of the world. He lived his life with a certain level of detachment and skepticism, confident that anything he couldn't see or measure simply didn't exist. However, that rigid worldview was about to be completely shattered. It started with the presence in his apartment, a ghost that defied every rule Jehyeon had ever lived by. But this wasn't just any haunting. It was something far more invasive and unsettling. As he stares into the dim light of his room, the chilling realization sets in, he is sharing his living space with a total pervert of a ghost. The boundary between the living and the dead has been crossed in the most uncomfortable way possible. The story of how Jehyeon ended up in this situation traces back to a few weeks ago. He was sitting in a brightly lit cafe, a place that felt worlds away from the supernatural. It was there that he reconnected with someone he had been running into quite frequently lately, Younghoo. Younghoo was a former classmate from Jehyeon's second year of high school. Back then, they weren't exactly friends, they moved in entirely different social circles. As Jehyeon watches Younghoo across the table, the other man is focused entirely on his chocolate latte, slurping it down with a level of enthusiasm that seems almost childish. Looking at him now, Jehyeon can't help but remember the irritation he used to feel toward Younghoo. In school, Younghoo had always stood out, but never in a way that Jehyeon admired. He was a habitual skipper, often arriving late or not showing up at all. Even when he was present, he was disruptive, frequently caught sleeping through lessons while the teacher yelled at him to wake up. To a serious student like Jehyeon, Younghoo represented a lack of discipline that was frustrating to witness. But what truly grated on Jehyeon's nerves were the stories Younghoo would tell. Younghoo was obsessed with the occult, often regaling his classmates with ridiculous tales of ghosts, spirits, and even aliens. He would talk about the 8-foot ghost that chased cars, making strange sounds as it ran. Jehyeon would sit nearby, listening to the murmurs of the occult story circle, thinking about how pathetic it was to believe in such things. He couldn't understand if Younghoo actually believed the nonsense or if he was just doing it for attention. Despite that friction, there was a brief period where they hung out together. During those moments, Jehyeon realized that Younghoo wasn't as bad as he had initially thought. There was an optimism to him, a transparency that was almost refreshing. Being around him had a strange way of easing Jehyeon's worries, making life feel a little less heavy. However, graduation came and went, and as often happens, they naturally lost contact. It was only recently that they began bumping into each other again, eventually leading to these occasional meetings to catch up over food. In the present, their relationship is maintained through brief text exchanges. Younghoo still sends the same kind of nonsense he used to talk about in school, asking bizarre questions that Jehyeon usually dismisses with a tired, "Please stop." Yet, despite the weirdness, they find themselves meeting up once more. As they sit together in the cafe, the conversation takes a more serious turn. Younghoo leans in, his expression becoming uncharacteristically earnest as he asks if Jehyeon is living on his own. He explains that he's currently looking for a place to stay after leaving the dorms. He's specifically looking in the Sinchon area and asks Jehyeon if he would be open to having a roommate. The request catches Jehyeon off guard. He hadn't ever considered sharing his space, but before he can even process the idea, Younghoo begins to explain his desperate situation. It turns out that Younghoo is completely broke. The CEO of his music label ran off with all of his money, leaving him with nothing. Jehyeon recalls seeing a news article about a fraud and embezzlement case involving a music label. Younghoo confirms the grim reality, he was one of the victims. As a struggling musician, being robbed of his earnings has left him with no choice but to find a new living arrangement as soon as possible. He looks at Jehyeon with a mixture of hope and desperation, unaware that by bringing their lives back together, they are both about to walk into a haunting neither of them is prepared for. Jehyeon finds himself caught in a difficult position. On one hand, he recently had to deal with a significant expense of his own, registering for an academy, which has made his financial situation tighter than usual. While taking on a roommate wouldn't hurt him financially, he can't help but feel a lingering hesitation. He wonders if it's truly a good idea to suddenly move in with someone like Young-hoo, a former classmate he was never particularly close with. Yet, looking at Young-hoo's dejected face, he feels a genuine sense of pity for the man's misfortune. Ultimately, the logic of the situation wins out. Jehyeon manages to find a listing for an apartment that seems almost too perfect. It's an older building, but the space is generous, a 3-bedroom unit with a dedicated living room. Spanning nearly 60 square meters and facing south to catch the sunlight, it is located only 5 minutes away from the subway station. But the most shocking part is the price. The deposit is only 5 million won, with a monthly rent of 300,000 won. When Young-hoo hears the terms, his eyes widen in disbelief. To him, the price is suspiciously low. He immediately voices his concerns, suggesting that a place this cheap must have a dark history, likely being the site of a bad incident or even a haunting. Jehyeon, however, remains unmoved. With his signature cold rationality, he tells Young-hoo that ghosts simply do not exist, and even if something had happened in the past, it wouldn't affect him. Young-hoo can only sigh, realizing that despite the years that have passed, Jehyeon hasn't changed his skeptical nature one bit. As they begin the process of moving their belongings into the new space, Young-hoo tries a different angle, asking Jehyeon about his thoughts on aliens. To Young-hoo's surprise, Jehyeon admits there is a mathematical chance they exist, but he quickly shuts down any talk of UFOs. He dismisses them as mere misidentifications, doctored footage, or even just bugs flying across a camera lens. When Young-hoo insists he once saw an alien descend to Earth, Jehyeon bluntly tells him it was all in his head. It's a familiar dynamic for them, reminiscent of their school days when Young-hoo's wild imagination constantly clashed with Jehyeon's rigid logic. Despite the bickering, they get settled in. The apartment is clean and spacious, with enough room for Young-hoo to set up his guitars and music equipment. Young-hoo is so relieved to have a roof over his head that he declares he wouldn't give up this spot even if a ghost did appear. He sprawls out on the hardwood floor, relishing the sense of home, even though the floor is still freezing because the boiler hasn't been turned on yet. The physical labor of moving quickly leaves them exhausted and starving. They decide to order Chinese food, and soon 2 bowls of jjajangmyeon are delivered to their new home. As they eat, Jehyeon notices that Young-hoo stops quite early, claiming he is stuffed. Jehyeon is surprised, noting that Young-hoo has a fairly large build and should, in theory, eat much more. Young-hoo explains with a somewhat distant look in his eyes that his stomach likely shrank during the years he spent starving while trying to make it with his band. The atmosphere in the room begins to shift as they finish their meal. Young-hoo suddenly begins to sweat, complaining about the heat and wondering if he's the only one feeling it. Jehyeon assumes he simply turned the boiler up too high earlier and offers to go turn it off. However, before he can react, Young-hoo takes matters into his own hands. Without a word of warning, he grabs the hem of his shirt and pulls it over his head, stripping down right there in the middle of the room. The sudden display of skin catches Jehyeon completely off guard. His face flushes a deep red as he stares at Young-hoo's toned torso, his composure momentarily shattered. He stammers out a protest, asking why Young-hoo is undressing while they're still sitting at the table. Young-hoo, however, is completely unfazed by the tension. He looks at Jehyeon with a casual, almost bored expression, telling him there's no reason to be shy since they both have the same parts. Young-hoo explains that back when he lived in the company-provided dorms with his bandmates, everyone walked around in their boxers and exercised half-naked all the time. To him, nudity among men is a non-issue. Jehyeon, still visibly flustered, tells him to hold back while they're living together, explaining that he grew up with a younger sister and is used to a much higher level of privacy. Young-hoo just smirks, jokingly asking if Jehyeon is simply embarrassed by his sexy body. Jehyeon quickly tells him to stop saying such weird things, but the easy, casual boundary Young-hoo has just crossed sets a new, slightly more intimate tone for their cohabitation. When Young-hoo mentions the cartoon his sister was watching, Jehyeon's curiosity is piqued. He asks what kind of cartoon it was, and Young-hoo simply replies, BL. The term is unfamiliar to Jehyeon, who asks for clarification, but before Young-hoo can explain, a sharp, metallic clattering sound echoes through the apartment. The noise is sudden and distinct, causing Young-hoo to pause mid-sentence. He looks around the room, asking Jehyeon if he heard that. Jehyeon, true to his skeptical nature, dismisses it immediately, telling Young-hoo that the only thing he hears is the nonsense coming out of his mouth. Young-hoo wonders if something fell in another room, but he doesn't dwell on it for long. Since he is already half naked, he decides it's the perfect time to go take a shower, leaving Jehyeon alone with his thoughts. As night falls over the new apartment, the silence becomes heavy. Jehyeon is lying in his bed, the covers pulled up, but sleep remains elusive. He stares into the darkness, his mind restless. He tells himself that he always takes a while to adjust to a new bed, but there is something else bothering him. The apartment is too quiet, and the lack of familiar sounds makes everything feel slightly off. He tries to remember what his usual routine was before bed, searching for a sense of normalcy that seems to have vanished. Despite it being the middle of winter, Jehyeon notices a strange sensation in the air. The house feels damp and heavy, a stark contrast to the dry cold he expected. He wonders if he is the only one sensing it, or if there is something fundamentally wrong with the building's insulation. Meanwhile, in the other room, Young-hoo is fast asleep, completely unbothered, sprawled out in his boxers. Unable to settle down, Jehyeon finally decides to get out of bed. He figures a glass of water might help calm his nerves. He walks quietly through the dark hallway into the kitchen, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows on the floor. He pours himself a cup of water and drinks it slowly, the cool liquid offering a momentary distraction from the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment. As he finishes his drink, Jehyeon looks out into the living area. The darkness seems deeper than before. He stands there for a moment, his eyes scanning the shadows. He feels a prickle of unease on the back of his neck, but he quickly shakes it off. He tells himself he must just be tired, that his mind is playing tricks on him because of the move. He reaches out to set his mug down on the counter, but just as he does, a faint, chilling whisper drifts through the air. "Don't go." The voice is barely a breath, but it is clear enough to make Jehyeon freeze. Before he can even turn his head to see where the sound came from, a sudden, invisible force seizes him. It's as if a pair of hands has grabbed him by the shoulders, and with a violent, jarring motion, he is pulled backward. Jehyeon loses his footing completely. He is thrown through the air, stumbling into Young-hoo's room. He crashes down onto Young-hoo's bed with a heavy thud, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. The sudden weight and movement wake Young-hoo instantly. He bolts upright, but finds himself pinned beneath Jehyeon's body. In the dim, filtered light of the bedroom, the two of them are locked in an incredibly intimate position. Jehyeon is draped over him, his face inches away from Young-hoo's. The warmth of their bodies presses together, and for a long, silent moment, neither of them moves. Jehyeon's glasses are slightly crooked, his eyes wide with shock and confusion as he stares down at his roommate. Young-hoo, still half dazed from sleep and feeling the heat of Jehyeon so close to him, looks up with a bewildered expression. His voice is low and raspy as he breaks the silence, asking, "What are you doing?" Jehyeon has no answer, trapped between the logic he clings to and the terrifying, unexplainable reality of what just happened. Guys, for the next chapter tell me in the comments box, should I just upload the chapters individually, or mass upload all the chapters together?